Now, Kojo,
Selwyn, can I come back in?
Yes, Kojo, go ahead.
Yeah, and I see Nigel is determined to do himself out of a job. Let me avoid it. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Let me avoid some of the more political things, but relevant and necessary things which Nigel has said, and be probably a little more boring. I think we have to sign up big time to solar. The issue of carbon fuels, really, I think it's a mirage. You know, long-term oil prices are going to be very low. Developing offshore oil is fiendishly expensive. Our supply will not shift the market from its current low long-term base. But we've got sunshine. You know, we're sitting on the equator. We've got a 90% empty country. You know, we can transform solar power into a Guyana thing, which we use to drop prices of electricity to ordinary Guyanese and really fuel industries in a major way. The second thing is that we need to pivot from our North American focus in terms of markets, in terms of economics, and pivot to Brazil. I mean, it's blindingly obvious that in terms of logistic costs, in terms of accessing markets, that Brazil makes a lot more sense, and the rest of South America, than North America, where quite frankly, we've long been uncompetitive, and we're not about to become competitive anytime soon. The third issue, and this is where I slightly disagree with Nigel, I think agro-industry has to be a focus. You know, large-scale agro-industry, especially utilizing the savannas adjacent to Roraima province in Brazil, has to be one, certainly for the next couple of decades,
but
key strategy.
Can I just in
sure.
that same area, Roraima, the savannas in Guyana, there are so poor quality soils there that really are they necessarily the best? We can argue this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want you to perhaps just address that.
Let me, and you make a very good point. But remember, we say agro-industry, so we can grow stuff in the more in the richer coastal and riverine soils where you've got lots of rich lands. But the industry part, the value add part, where you take products and you turn, you know. That's the place where I believe we need to. And I had a discussion about 2 years ago with the governor of the Roraima province, and you know, and his point was very clear. He says we've been asking the Guyana government this for years, you know, to engage around that area, to have an economic policy which effectively turns a lot of the Rupununi into a industrial zone where Brazilian money can come and set up factories to process stuff for Brazil. Now, I think we got to be brave and stop looking at sovereignty as being something about, you know, this is our land, etc. We have to understand that this is a resource we have, which we need to bequeath to our children. And if we've done nothing with it after 50 years, as Nigel says, it's a real indictment, and we can't continue to do that.
So,
before we leave agriculture, if you don't mind, I just want to give a plug to the coconut industry. Guyana has a thriving coconut industry, and it can do much better. But sort of touching on what Kojo just said, do you know what they do with most of the coconut husks? The husk of the coconut is just, in most cases, either burnt or tossed in the river. Well, I'm speaking specifically of the Pomeroon, and it's allowed to float to the mouth, to the Atlantic. It sinks and it creates a shallow draft and a lot of hazards for the vessels. Well, do you know what can be done with that husk? It has so many byproducts, from mattresses to rope to briquettes for barbecue. We have not yet touched on all these recyclable agricultural products that we've so much neglected in the past, and that was one of my focuses when I was in Guyana. It's sort of on hold right now, but certainly it is something that we do need to consider.
Nigel,
you know, Selwyn.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Neil's been there.
Go ahead.
Yes, I have, and it's very beautiful. I have to take a slightly different path. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been an entrepreneur for I don't know how long, and I think part of the challenge of this conversation and part of the challenge of, a lot of the conversation is that the focus is on government doing things versus entrepreneurs setting the agenda. And, my belief is the government needs to be a great cheerleader. When you do something right, cheer and, make sure that there are policies in place to support those things. If you're doing something wrong, smack them on the hands and change it, So this focus on what the government should do and 20-year plans, etc. Let the marketplace dictate where the opportunities are, where entrepreneurs are prepared to invest their monies and time and energy, and then the government gets behind those. Those are not strategic. Maybe the government will dissuade them, but those that they agree, there's a value proposition for the country as a whole, then make sure that there's the right policies and incentives, etc. So I just, we may be saying the same thing, but I'm coming from a totally different, from the entrepreneurial perspective. That's all.
I just want to react to that. I wasn't for 1 second suggesting, or nor that I intend to suggest, that this is primarily a responsibility of the government, but certainly in terms of infrastructural development, we have to remember that comparatively, if you take into account the globe, Guyana is an extremely rudimentary state of development. You can't get in any form of vehicle and get to where the resources are located and get back in under 24 hours. If you were going to a gold mine, if you were going to any sort of location where resources, whether agriculture or otherwise, agriculture on the coast, it's a difficult proposition. So I think at the initial stage, the government does have to create the environment, including the infrastructure. On the project where we were exchanging ideas just now about Lethem, I think long-term, you need a railroad between Manaus at the minimum and Lethem just to be able to move product from there to Manaus quickly. You need a railroad if we're going to be using the highly rich coastal soils to move that product. So that sort of infrastructural development, the government has to set the framework. I completely agree with you. The entrepreneurs will come in. Somebody may want to invest in the railroad, but the government at the end of the day, because we are so far behind the curve, has to at least begin to manage that framework and have plans, because even you, if you were, not averse, would have some questions about whether you go and plant your $2 billion down in Guyana now, what guarantees you have, et cetera, et cetera.
But and I think Neil, I can feel and understand the frustration that hugely creative and inventive people like yourself have in the context of countries like Guyana, not being able to unleash your entrepreneurial energies. But I want to point out something, and we must be careful. And it really builds on what the point Nigel was making. I don't know any country which has significantly transformed the fortunes of its people, particularly a poor country like Guyana, where the government has not led. And we mustn't run away from it. Let's take the example of Singapore, which everyone talks about, or Malaysia, which everyone, says is the modern version of Singapore, or Taiwan, or China.
Chile.
In Chile, yes. In all of these countries, the government leads actively. So Neil, while I understand your frustration, I think we must be clear that unless we are talking about, high per capita GDP countries like America, etc., where the basics have been done, okay, the government has to play a very active and interventionist role. I haven't seen it done anywhere before. I taught entrepreneurship. I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not either clever or inventive enough to be an entrepreneur, but I've taught entrepreneurship in a couple of, for many years in university. And one of the things I know is that true entrepreneurs are rare, Neil. There are not too many of you running around the place. And there are not enough of you to drive an aggressive developmental agenda for somewhere like Guyana. So yes, the state has to become more efficient. The state has to become much more meritocratic in driving development. But the state has to take that responsibility. That's why we elect them.
I want to
Yeah.
I want to speak to a previous point that both Kojo and Nigel made about a national plan and the importance of having the political stakeholders buy into this plan. Now, in terms of continuity, if that, and we're talking about, as Nigel mentioned, 20 to 25 years long-term vision. Um, if that were to take place today, how do we guarantee? Because governments change, and there is a possibility that the government will continue to change. But how do we guarantee the continuity of those policies?
Nigel,
Well, I
you
think
talk
one of the
about it.
things that the president is doing that is, in my mind, very critical is recognizing that governments don't run countries, public servants do. And you need a sophisticated, well-educated public service class so that as governments change, it is really the senior public servants that ensure policies continue, whatever evolutionary changes that the new government may want to implement, they can, make that happen as well. But the bottom line is, politicians are elected for 4 years, 5 years, or whatever the case may be. And you're right, there are going to be policies and strategies. You're building a new city. Well, that doesn't happen in 2 weeks. So you need that type of infrastructure in terms of a sophisticated public service that can make that happen. And then you, of course, have to have the political wherewithal to make sure that it stays that way. And the next government doesn't come in and say, well, get out of the way, I know what's best. So I think that's a bigger challenge. But I think the president is spot on in trying to recreate, if you will, a public service infrastructure.
Someone, if I could perhaps attempt to respond to that. I think that critical to the success of this project is the major political players getting involved now and having a discussion with the appropriate data and signing off on it. Mm-hmm. So that even if you come in, let's take education. If our goal for the next 20 years is whatever we set as the goal, and all the major political players come in and sign off on the macro vision, when you get in, you may change emphasis if you want accelerated growth in some areas, but the overall framework remains the same. So that's the importance of having people participate at this stage, at the design stage of the project. So everybody feels that they have a stake in it. It's not as if this becomes an APNU AFC project or it becomes a PPP project. It really becomes a Guyana 2020 project in which all the political players know. Of course, there will always be new political players who will come on from time to time. But once the population understands that the major players have bought into this developmental plan, and God forbid, it's difficult in Guyana, nobody claims the plan as theirs for a political entity, but it becomes a Guyana national plan. What we will have is that we will have arguments about implementation and emphasis, but essentially that plan has to be in part. So if you don't have the incentive for people to buy in now, the incentive will be that whenever a new government gets in or whenever there's a change, then they will try to do their own thing. And of course, Guyana suffers in the interim. So that's how I think that the structure will work.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add a couple of things to that, because those are really key points that you made. And Neil, the point you make about a meritocratic civil service whose tenure is guaranteed outside gross misconduct or fraud, etc., is critical. And again, that's a feature of all countries which have developed consistently and persistently over time. I think one of the issues that we need to face, though, and I'd love Nigel to come in on this, is the nature of our politics. Our politics for 50 years have been premised on access to resources. You get into power and you effectively monopolize resources which you then share out to your buddies. That's be it under the first PNC government or the previous government, and it's not clear that the same isn't going to happen under this current government, because we're absolutely fair to the other side, the other 50%. If they were to get into power, they're going to do the same thing. So we have this self-fulfilling prophecy, where those with formal power see it as being imperative to monopolize that access. Now, in that situation, quite frankly, even if you have the best plans in the world, okay, they're not going to work, because you don't have the security of knowing that even if you were to leave power, you can support what's happening and still have reasonable access to resources. So we need to kind of remove the winner-take-all scenario, which has really dominated politics for 50 years in Guyana. Now, I mean, it's a longer conversation as to how you do that, but part of it has to be, I think, in terms of embedding certain constitutional roles, so that you can't go firing PSs willy-nilly. Okay, so that if you were to entrench a constitutional amendment which says we want to have every person under 15, up to year 15, to have free education or whatever. So there's certain of these things we're going to have to embed constitutionally, and some of them we'll have to dialogue, as Nigel suggests. But we're certainly not at the stage now where there's enough confidence across the political spectrum to sign off on the plan, because everyone is going to be suspicious, that the other side is planning some little trickery. We don't have enough trust in society, and I think if I'd be glad to be persuaded otherwise. Okay, but we need to start from that recognition.
I wouldn't even attempt to persuade Kojo to the contrary. That I think is a given. We have to change the incentive regime, because what happens is that people aspire to office so that they can get their hands on the goodies. And until you change the incentive regime, i.e. the winner does not take all, and you guarantee equal opportunity as best you can within a constitutional framework. But more particularly, I think part of this discussion historically, which we don't want to acknowledge, is that we have to change our political culture, or our culture generally as Guyanese. Because if you were to speak to, I dare say, a significant number of the population today, they almost think it's a right that if you win the election, then you are entitled to do as you wish with the state's resources. Now, with the best will in the world, and Guyana, I have to admit this, Guyana perhaps has the most advanced constitution in the Caribbean in terms of the expression of rights and protection of those rights and the direct implementation of various treaties in Guyana. But the reality is, if the culture is totally different, you can have the best plans on paper, but if the culture doesn't exist, then you have a problem. So I think we have to involve perhaps the sociologists and the psychologists in a real discussion about how we change this culture so that the incentives now are different. The winner can no longer take all. We need to prevent that. But at the same time, we need to have a culture in which we frown on people who attempt to monopolize the resources of the state to the disadvantage of others.
Kojo,
I
have a question for you specifically.
Right.
And we have had this conversation many times. When we were much younger, the people who repatriated and held high offices were in their 30s and 40s. Today, and I'm speaking especially to the independence babies or the independence generation, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, those of us born in that time. That doesn't seem to be the status quo today. What changed? Do you think conditions back then were more conducive? There was a more adequate framework to encourage repatriation and involvement? Do you think that has changed?
That's part of it, Selwyn. The failure, especially towards the latter end of the kind of the experiment in a sort of national socialist agenda in the first PNC government, I think disillusioned quite a lot of people, not just people in the opposition, but people who supported the party either for ethnic or ideological reasons. So people went back, decided they were going to simply put their heads down and work. The messages they passed on to their children who were perhaps born outside or went outside relatively small, relatively young, were not necessarily positive. So those people never really expressed or developed an active interest in Guyana from much of the late 80s, early 90s. I think once the political struggle in Guyana became much sharper from the sort of early 2000s, then people started to re-engage. And a lot of those people were older people who had been outside for very long and therefore understood some of the issues in Guyana. But that generation in between still remained disengaged. The other thing that changed is that for that generation, which essentially grew up outside of Guyana, and the younger generation you're talking about, Selwyn, you know, lots of sexy things happened, like the internet, etc. And they really want to be in an environment which offers them those sorts of opportunities. Guyana doesn't, you know. So they're both demographic issues, technological issues, and socioeconomic issues, which mean that most of the people in the diaspora who engage in the Guyana debate, etc., quite frankly, we're bringing pretty ancient 60s, 70s perspectives of Guyana and some of those dynamics to play, which, quite frankly, is part of the reason why there probably hasn't been as much progress in the discourse. Because when I look at the discourse, you know, we're rehashing arguments from the 70s and the 80s, you know, and if I were a 30-something-year-old living in New York, I really don't want to get involved in that. That's not helping me anyhow, you know. I don't want to have those very negative, very uninspiring discourses about who did what in the 70s to who are in the 50s or 60s. So we really need to make the discourse relevant to some of those highly skilled, talented people out there in the diaspora who can really help to transform Guyana. The last thing I want to mention, Selwyn, so we need to stop telling people they have to come back to Guyana to serve Guyana. Okay? Most of them are not going to do that, especially the particularly high-value, talented people. They will not do it. Okay? So we need to develop, and this is probably for Nigel and his colleagues in government, to say, how do we create structures and facilitate contributions to Guyana, okay, by people who either can occasionally come to Guyana or don't need to come to Guyana at all. And certainly there are lots of ways using new media, ICTs, etc., where this can happen.
I fully agree with Kojo on that. That new platform is where the discussion should take place. I mean, this is a classic example. Here we're getting contribution from 4 out of 5 Guyanese, and I'm talking about the future of Guyana. And none of us, apart from me, sorry, nobody is here. This is the sort of discussion that has to take place. And I agree with Kojo in the sense that to really attract the talent, and I don't say it's only the high value talent, the talent that exists at all levels, especially if they have children, the first thing they think about is, where am I going to send my kids to school? And secondly, health. So I think the discussion has to move from people physically coming back. We certainly have the platform here. And what we need to do, and I think we're attempting to do, is to have the discussion about how we generally bring Guyana up so that it is more competitive as a destination for investment, as a destination for people who want to live, retire, whatever, so that, you know, on whatever box you have, we check off outside of just the pure emotional argument.